Okay, we will get started. Good afternoon and Ramadan Kareem to all those joining us today. My name is Noha El-Mikawi. I am the Dean of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the American University in Cairo. Glad to have you join our Tahrir Dialogue number 104. Our event today on Europe in a Changing World is an online-only event. Throughout the interventions of our speakers, whom I will introduce shortly, you are to write your questions in the chat room. We will not open the microphone for questions. I will summarize all the questions that I will be monitoring in the chat room, and I will read them out to the panelists during the question and answer session. We will have a hard stop of this session at 2:15. So I hope everyone will cooperate in being punctual. There will be translation of this session from English to Arabic and Arabic to English. If you need translation, kindly press the button interpretation down on your screen. Around the world, observers of global affairs are not sure whether the new era will usher liberal democratic dominance or reintroduce bipolarity with Cold War dynamics, or establish multipolarity with pragmatic, unpredictable, issue-based alliances. The new era certainly promises to be volatile. We have with us today two excellent speakers to reflect on those issues. And the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at AUC intends to continue such reflections in the future from different regions around the world. Today, we are focusing on Europe, and we have with us Ambassador Frank Hartmann, who is Germany's ambassador to Egypt and the former commissioner for crisis management at the Federal German Foreign Office in Berlin. With us as well is Ms. Susie Dennison, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Her topics of focus include strategy, politics, and cohesion in European foreign policy. Ambassador Hartmann and Ms. Dennison will help us better understand how Germany and Europe are defining their economic and geopolitical security in a changing world. With us as well, our distinguished Dr. Ibrahim Awad, Professor of Global Affairs and Director of the Center on Migration and Refugee Studies at the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy here at AUC. He will provide some of his reflections on the interventions of our distinguished guests. I'm so happy to welcome Ambassador Hartmann and Ms. Dennison to this round. Ambassador Hartmann, the German Chancellor tells us that a tectonic shift is taking place and a new era is emerging. What is this new era all about? And how will Germany bolster its security and that of Europe while fostering a peaceful, just international order? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Noha El-Mikawi. It's a great honor to be part of the Tahrir Dialogue. Of course, it would have been an even nicer pleasure if we could have met all together in person at your beautiful premises at Tahrir Square. And also a welcome to Ms. Susie Dennison and Professor Ibrahim Awad. I think it's a very important and timely topic to discuss. What does the Russian war in Ukraine have in terms of consequences for European security and for my country, Germany, in the heart of Europe in particular? So I don't know whether you have read the article by Olaf Scholz or not in the Foreign Affairs, but I will take this as a basis and go through some of the main arguments, but I will tune it also because we've been in lots of discussions of this kind in Egypt about the war and the consequences of the war from a European perspective. And we have, of course, in the audience, the Egyptian perspective, and there will be lots of things to discuss. So I try to keep it shortly, and Ramadan Kareem to everybody now being at home in the midst of Ramadan. So what does Zeitenwende means, a tectonic shift, mean for us? The first year, the war have been enrolled since 24th of February 2022. What does it mean in terms of our interpretation from Germany and also from here? It is a tectonic shift. We have seen, and we are aware, and we are concerned that the whole rule-based international order is called into question. This war of aggression, as we call it, the invasion in Ukraine, was a blatant breach of the UN Charter, and namely by one of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. So the question is whether or not the UN will be paralyzed by that. It is, this is called into question. The efficiency of the UN system is at stake. It was the attempt, and it's still ongoing attempt, to change borders in the midst of Europe through a violent aggression, which we cannot accept. And this war in particular is a war against the sovereignty of another country. Even the pure existence of Ukraine is being called into a question, and it is an important step and a deplorable war against the civilian population. As we all know through the media, the civilian infrastructure has been heavily attacked and has been targeted by the Russians, and tens of thousands of deaths had to be deplored, and millions of refugees, including nearly 1 million refugees from Ukraine in my country, in Germany. So it is a humanitarian catastrophe in Europe. For us, this means definitely the end of the post-Cold War era in Europe, and we think worldwide. The 1990s and the early 2000s have been an era of relatively stability and peace in Europe. We have seen the German unification of 1990 coming peacefully about. The Iron Curtain came down, and we saw also a unification of Europe, not only unification of Germany, but the EU was enlarged, but in fact it was the return of the Eastern European countries to the family of Europe, which we appreciated very much in an era of stability as we saw it. And at the same time, we in Germany have tried to establish trusted and friendly neighboring relations with Russia. We are actually an indirect neighbor to Russia. Russia is a very close, used to be a very close partner to us economically, and we had ideals and hopes that Russia could be integrated into the European security architecture by establishing strong and reliable economic and friendly relations. We have heavily invested in Russia, and we became over the years overly dependent even on energy imports from Russia, namely on gas. More than 55% of our gas before the war was imported to Russia. And we realized this was in a way naive. We have wrongly we have wrongly estimated the reliability of Russia. Some people say the previous Russia policy was a mistake. It was naive to believe that these relations would remain stable. What happened in Russia? In 2007, President Putin, for the first time at the Munich Security Conference, said American posture is an American dominance in the world. He condemned the American foreign policy approach, and namely in Europe. In 2008, we had the war against Georgia. And in 2014, the invasion of Crimea, and of course, the splitting apart of the eastern Ukrainian provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk. And we, from the German perspective, have been heavily engaged to find diplomatic solutions to the Eastern Ukraine issue through the Minsk agreement and what we call the Normandy format. So Germany, together with France, was actively involved to try to find a stable framework to get this conflict under control. But unfortunately, and eventually, this was not possible because Russia did finally not cooperate in this framework. And only 2 days before the war, our Chancellor Olaf Scholz traveled to Moscow, and President Putin lied at him and said there will not be any invasions. This is just a posturing of threat to increase the pressure. But don't worry, there will not be a full-fledged war. And 2 days later, we know what happened. So the consequences of this invasion are a potential erosion of the multilateral system of the United States, of the United Nations. We have to readdress and the mistakes and the failure of Germany's Russia politics towards the years of 2000. And it nearly brings to an end, or the question remains open, whether the OECE process in Europe, which was established in 1975 to have a framework of security cooperation between East and West, the OECE process of the Helsinki Convention, is still alive or not. So how does the world order change after 2023? It is clear to us that we do not want to enter into a new Cold War area. I do not believe that the answer will be a binary world order between Russia and the United States. And it should not, in this whole discussion, when we talk to countries like Egypt and other countries in the South, so-called global South, it should not be a debate about us or them, but it should be a debate about maintaining the principles of the international order and the international law. That is very important for my country. We do not expect countries like Egypt to take sides, but to be outspoken how the international order and the international law shall be maintained and how the United Nations remain to be effective. It will be a multipolar world order. And the main antagonists in the future will not be the US and Russia, but in our eyes, the United States and China. Russia may transform even more into a junior partner of China, but the main dynamics of potential rivalry and conflict will be between the United States and China and not between the United States and Russia anymore. And this current war of aggression, in my eyes, should not be interpreted as a systemic conflict. It is not, as you initiated, Nora, in your initial remarks, it is not about dominance of one system over the other, of liberal democracies over authoritarian governments, but it is, as I said, about how shall we jointly together maintain the international rule-based world order. And that is the main argument with which we have tried to win countries like Egypt over in the United States, in the United Nations, to vote for these altogether 4 resolutions where the aggression was condemned in the United Nations General Assembly. Some countries in the global South feel less affected. They say this is a European conflict. Why do you not bring this to an end? This is a challenge to Russia's position after the post-Cold War era. You cannot find a peaceful settlement in your relations with Russia, which I refute, because Germany in particular has tried to do that over 20 years, but in the end it failed. And the argument the West has to bring this war to an end, please do it, whatever is necessary to bring the war to an end, which I'm hearing very often here in Egypt, is not leading us to a solution, because a peace cannot be made on the back of Ukraine. It is not the West, the Germans, the French, or the US decision to decide under which conditions shall a country possibly forfeit part of its territory. And just imagine the end of the Israeli-Egyptian conflict. It could not have been imposed from the outside world to say what are the conditions under which Israel or Egypt have to make peace. Give up part of your territories. This would be unacceptable for everybody. So last word, what does this Zeitenwende, the tectonic shift, mean for Germany and for Europe? First of all, we have to work to maintain and to protect the international system of the United Nations. And we have to cooperate with our partners in the South, with India, with Turkey, with Egypt, and many others to maintain this framework of world order. Otherwise, conflicts like this one will be exported to many other regions in the world, including countries in Africa, where we see a growing Russian influence and a destabilizing influence in countries like Mali, like Central African Republic and others. We in Germany have to improve our own defense capabilities, and we did so by investing 100 billion euros for defense, because in the post-Cold War era, the 90s, we may have neglected our defense capabilities because we thought in an era of peace and stability, a large army and a very modernized equipment is no more necessary. And this was proven to be wrong. And we increase our contribution to NATO to 2% of the GDP. We see the European Union and the NATO strengthened as a result of this conflict. Our responses became much more coherent and powerful. The sanctions packages of the EU and also the NATO enlargement of Finland and Sweden is calling Russian intentions actually into question. They strengthened the NATO. They achieved, we think, quite the opposite of what they wanted to achieve, to weaken the Western structures. And also the transatlantic alliance has rather been strengthened than weakened. Our policy of arms export has been completely revised. There is a sea change of German export policy, because it was our main principle not to export into war-struck conflict areas. But we believe, and we strongly believe, and there have been surveys in Europe and in Germany, that we have a responsibility to put Ukraine into a position that they can exercise their right of self-defense. Ukraine, I think, would cease to exist if they would not have the means to defend themselves, and we would have a Russian invasion at the eastern borders of the NATO members if we had not have them to defend themselves. But NATO and Germany, we think, are not part of the conflict, and we don't want to become part of the conflict. So this is a very fine balance, which is also described in this article. To what extent can you support another country which is defending itself in a war of aggression without becoming part of the war itself? This is also an important conclusion, and I'm coming to an end. We have to support also others to alleviate the economic consequences of this war, namely countries which are heavily struck by the food security crisis, like Egypt. And we have increased our cooperations with Egypt, in particular on the food security issue, with increasing all our packages of support to World Food Programme and other things. So we have to strengthen the resilience of countries in the south with the support also from our countries to deal with the consequences of the economic and financial crisis. And energy and gas in Europe, we have to diversify our energy supplies. We are not importing anymore any gas or oil from Russia. And this even intensifies our domestic boost to renewable energies, which we try to double from 40% in the energy mix to 80% by 2030. So this is also an economic and energy transition, which is even being accelerated by the stop of energy import from Russia. But we should not forget, of course, how do we bring this conflict to an end? We all have to seek solutions to this conflict. We have to contain a further escalation, which nobody wants. There have been talks about nuclear dimension of this, which we do not believe in, that we should embark into this discussion. And there are countries like China, Turkey, India, and others, and maybe also countries in the Arab League, who could play a stronger role in finding middle way grounds and dialogue and mitigate a kind of dialogue between Russia and Ukraine. But so far, Russia was not even willing to engage in any kind of a diplomatic solution if it is not under the conditions of a surrender by Ukraine. So we have to find solutions out of this crisis. We have to support the countries which are mostly affected, but we also have strengthened the European and transatlantic security and cooperation network. But the sea change, which is affecting or taking effect to the global security, I think is going much further than Europe. It will also affect countries in the Arab world, in Africa, and around the globe, because the main premises of the international order with a strong UN Charter and a strong a strong UN system with the Security Council have been called into question, and that is the new world order we have to deal with in an intensified dialogue with countries like yourselves to find answers to this question. So I hope I wasn't too long. 12 minutes, I count. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hartman. I appreciate very much your intervention, which covered quite a lot of ground, very complex ground. You said the way you see it and the way Germany sees it is a serious erosion of the multilateral system, but not a pathway to a binary world order, something that of course, we appreciate very much in the German position. Susie Dennison, Senior Fellow with the European Council on Foreign Relations. You've heard what Ambassador Hartman had to say, and what you are about to tell us is a very interesting story, because the European Council on Foreign Relations added to this view a view from the citizens of Europe in a recent survey of, if I'm not mistaken, over 19,000 European citizens, as well as some citizens of China, Russia, and Turkey who responded to that survey. And the European Council published the results of that survey in a policy brief with a fascinating title that reads, United West, Divided from the Rest, Global Public Opinion 1 year into Russia's war on the Ukraine. Ms. Dennison, please unpack for us the findings of the survey and their implications from your perspective on European foreign policy in this changing world order. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction. And just to pass on my apologies to all the participants who came expecting to see Mark Leonard, the director of ECFR, but I am not him because he's ill today. But I will do my best to share the results of this report nevertheless, which I worked closely with him on. I think that a lot of what Ambassador Hartman has laid out at a policy level is echoed in the public opinion survey that we carried out at the beginning of this year. So in January, indeed in 9 EU countries, the UK, and then China, India, Turkey, Russia, and the US. I'm going to, if I may, share my screen with you so that I can talk in a little more detail about those public opinion results. So just bear with me, and I will go through just a few bits and pieces of data. So the first point, as Noah alluded to in her opening words, is indeed that what we can see in terms of thinking about the war in Ukraine a year after Russia's invasion is that there is a coming together, if you like, of public opinion in what you might define as the West, the EU 9 countries we looked at, Great Britain and the United States, around the idea that Ukraine needs to regain all of its territory, even if that means a longer war. And this is quite interesting to see, because particularly focusing on the EU point of view, where we asked this question over 6 months ago, we have seen a growth in this sense that, as Ambassador Hartman laid out, this is for Ukraine to define the terms of peace on which they're willing to negotiate. But there is a sense that Europeans who are maybe taking a slightly bigger hit than those in the West, economically speaking, for supporting that, are willing to stand behind Ukraine for as long as it takes. So the message which we're hearing at policymaker level is echoed in public opinion in Europe. But what is particularly interesting is when you dig down into this picture at political level within European countries, you can see that this idea of the importance of unity behind Ukraine spans the traditional political divides. So we've just given three examples here of political groups which are very well known in the European context, to underline that this is not about a sort of a surge in liberal internationalism, but this is an idea which unites both conservative nationalists such as Poland's PIS government supporters with parties like supporters of parties like Germany's Green, La République En Marche here in France, where I'm speaking from. And this is very much a dominant opinion across these different political groups. There's a sense that we can see that in tandem with this feeling that that Europe and the West needs to continue the strong stance which has been taken against Russia's war for as long as it takes, is a sense of reinforcement of the idea that the EU of the EU's strength. And the slide that I'm showing you now details that, as you can see, in most of the European countries that we looked at, the majority opinion is that the EU is stronger or still strong coming out of this conflict. This also bears through into perceptions of the US in Europe. As you can see here, these are even stronger. This conviction of relative global strength. But there has been an important shift in terms of thinking about Russia for obvious reasons as a result of this, colleague. The question which I'm showing you here is as to whether or not people felt that for their country, Russia is an ally, a necessary partner with whom we have to work, a rival or an adversary. And as you can see, there's a very strong predominance of the opinion in the West that Russia is a rival or an adversary. The picture is very different in India, China, and Turkey, and I will come on to that very shortly. But this is the beginnings of the sense of where the West and other global players are perceiving this conflict quite differently. Just very quickly to finish on Russia and echoing the comments which Ambassador Hartman was making about the process that has been going on of decoupling economically from Russia. There is still a very strong sense among the European public that we need to avoid buying any energy fuels from Russia, even if that means taking a hit on security of supply. I think it's clear that in Europe we've had a less difficult winter than some might feared, both weather-wise and in terms of our supplies holding up. And I think this has reinforced a sense, along with the perceived successes of the Ukrainian army in pushing back against Russia by Europeans, that we are on the right path and we need to stay on that path in terms of the decoupling and sanctions packages which have been put in place. However, there is a much more mixed picture when it comes to Russia, both within Europe and more broadly, on this question of whether or not the conflict has weakened Russia. And I wanted to just demonstrate this with this graphic here, because you can see that for some Europeans, and this pertains to some extent to geography within the EU, that a sense that a different perception on whether Russia is weaker or stronger as a result of this. And you can see particularly Estonia, Poland, and Denmark as the strongest countries, a real sense that Russia has been weakened, but much more mixed, nuanced views, largely in the parts of Europe that are further away from Russia. Coming on then to other global players, and I want to start out this section by commenting on the title of the report, which Noah alluded to, that it is, of course, shorthand for a much more nuanced picture. And I couldn't agree more with Ambassador Hartman on the point that there is a broad range of views on almost any aspect of this conflict from different global players. So I think that firstly, one of the steps that we need to take in thinking about how we engage as Europeans in this environment is to think less in terms of the global south and more in terms of the individual relationships with the countries that we're working with in this multipolar world. So coming back to the first slide, what I want to emphasize here is the difference between India, Turkey, as well as Russia and China from the Western players in terms of their perceptions on how the war needs to end. There is a much stronger sense, which very much underlines what Ambassador Hartman has been hearing in his work in Egypt, that the conflict needs to end as soon as possible, and even if that means negotiating on the terms of that peace. And thinking about why the West is doing what it does in Ukraine, there are also quite distinct differences between the Western countries that we looked at and the non-Western countries, if you like. The prevailing sense in terms of why Europe and the United States stand behind Ukraine for Europeans is that this is about security primarily, and secondly, this is about defending Ukraine as a democracy. But as you can see, the largest answer in Russia, China, and India is this idea that what is going on is a defense of Western dominance of the system, or at least an attempt to do so. India is different here, and as we will see as we go through the data, there are a number of places in which India is different, but there is more of a sense from Indian respondents that this is about defending democracy. I think the second interesting finding around this picture is that we asked the question in this poll on which countries come closest to having a real democracy. And what you can see from that is that the West is not understood to have the last word on democracy, and therefore be in a position to defend democracy in a lot of the other settings that we looked at. There is a strong view that in China, India, and it's the predominant view in Turkey as well, that their own country comes closest to having a real democracy. Now, obviously, we can ask the question about whether respondents in all of these settings, given the timing that this survey took place, are responding in the way that they feel they should respond, or with genuine conviction. I think that's particularly true in China, because I should note that the survey took place when there was a lot of anti-COVID demonstrations going on and the crackdown. So there's a lot of tension around this question. But nevertheless, I think it's interesting data to feed into this broader picture. The previous speakers have also talked a little about the next world order and what different countries are expecting to emerge. And indeed, I can confirm from the survey work that we've been doing that this idea of a bipolar world, ongoing strategic competition dominated by the US and China, is not what countries such as Russia, Turkey, India are preparing for. Rather, they see the likely scenario in 10 years as being a much more even distribution of global power among multiple countries, and a sense that things are shifting, that this will no longer be a bipolar scenario. And just to go into a little detail, I think, on India and Turkey, because they're particularly interesting, as others have highlighted in this context. There seems to be in the data a certain confidence in these countries about dealing with that multipolar picture, which one perhaps doesn't perceive as much in the countries of the West. I'm showing you here the data about how Turkey sees other powers and how other powers see Turkey. So this same question on whether or not others are allies, partners, rivals, or adversaries. And as you can see here, Turkey does seem to be living this this policy of working with everybody. That there's a sense in terms of how Turkey sees other players that these are necessary partners, largely in some cases allies, but this tends to be the predominant answer from the Turkish perspective. And in India as well, there is a much stronger sense on this front of the necessity of cooperation with allies and necessary partners, with the exception, for obvious reasons, of China in that picture. So just to bring that all together, a few conclusions that we take away from this data is this idea that the West is more united than ever. This, to some extent, was counterintuitive. If we think about where we were a year ago, there was major questioning about whether or not unity around the firm stance against Russia's war of aggression could be maintained, given the consequences for Europeans and the spending consequences for the US of that picture. But that has proved to be wrong, and that has proved to be quite resilient and cross-party, as I said at the beginning. But what we can also see is that in this picture, Europe and the West is perhaps less influential than ever. And in a sense, one can see that we are perhaps victims of our own unity. There's this perceived sense of the West operating together, but operating in a sense of trying to preserve the status quo ante, which is not something which other powers recognize. And there's this feeling that the consolidated West has actually alienated other players in the ways in which we're engaging. So I think that I would very much echo the picture that Noah painted in her introductory words of the expectation of a shifting alliance-based system going forward, and that is going to be quite a major adjustment for us in the West in terms of learning how to operate in that environment. So I will stop there and hand back to the chair.
Thank you very much. I know that this is a very rich survey, and you've done a marvelous job, Susie, in giving us some very interesting findings, with also a very interesting final implication, a united Europe that seems, at least from this survey, to be less influential and needs to get ready for a world that has very volatile and shifting alliances. I think all countries around the world need to get ready for such alliance volatility moving forward. We have with us our distinguished professor of global affairs and director of the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies at the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy here at AUC, Professor Ibrahim Awad, who's been listening carefully and has read both Olaf Scholz's article and the survey of the European Council. And we're all ears, Professor Ibrahim Awad, to listen to your reflections. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dean Noah, and I wish to thank Ambassador Hartman and Ms. Dennison for a very clear presentation of the arguments of the survey. The article is extremely interesting, and the survey also reveals, brings out findings of great importance. I think that the grave concern shown by Germany is justified. The concern in Europe that the invasion of Ukraine arose is certainly justified. Europe has had a history in the 20th century, the 19th century, since the emergence of the nation-state system that justified this concern. Tens of millions, no other continent has seen the massacres that Europe has witnessed, and therefore Europe is keen on avoiding any cause for the repetition of the tragedies that it has witnessed. The article by Chancellor Scholz is rich. Many aspects can be commented upon. However, for the sake of time, I will focus on one argument that was repeatedly emphasized, and justifiably so, by Ambassador Hartman and by the article, which is that the invasion is an erosion of the multilateral system, of the UN system, and of the rules-based international order. There is no question that the invasion is a violation of international law, is a violation of, and specifically, as the article says, of the article on the principles of the UN Charter, in particular, paragraph 4, which is about refraining from the use of force or the threat of use of force. It is also a violation of the paragraph on the respect of the sovereignty, on the equal sovereignty of all states. There is no question about that. And I think in this region where we are particularly sensitive to that because sovereignty has been violated in our region, because force has been used in our region, because multiple aspects of ignoring these principles have been witnessed in the region. So there's no question about that. And therefore, the invasion should be clearly condemned. Now, the international order has not been always very respected by the parties that defend it now. So, and this is a weak point in the position of the West, as the survey calls it, or the transatlantic alliance. And this is, I think, what may explain the hesitation by countries in the South. Last year, you had a resolution of the General Assembly, and this year you had the same resolution and almost the same majorities. However, when a draft resolution was submitted to the Council on Human Rights, the vote was different. So there is a sort of hesitation on the part of countries of the global South, because there have been examples of rules that have been ignored. We have several invasions by the United States in Grenada, for instance. You have the interference in Chile in the 1970s. But you have in this region also the annexation of Golan. I know that Europe does not recognize the recognition of the annexation of Golan, but the United States does recognize and bestows legitimacy on the annexation of Golan. The same applies about the policies of Israel in the region, the intervention, the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Of course, Germany was against, and this is recognized. And the Security Council did not authorize this intervention, and this intervention was obviously against all rules of the international order and of international law. So I think this is what weakens the position of the transatlantic alliance. And so you have a tension in the global South. You have a tension in the global South, in this region, between condemning the invasion, no question about that. But on the other hand, international order is not, let alone that it should be democratized. It should be more democracy should be introduced in the functioning of the international order. But let's leave this aside, because this is not the moment to talk about that. But in fact, the order that exists, as it exists, has not been always respected. So something should be done to reconcile these contradictions, this tension. And this is what would give strength to the position of the West and transatlantic. I turn to a very interesting survey carried out by the European Council on Foreign Relations. I think I think that indeed we can talk about the West divided from the rest, the West united and divided from the rest. I think that the West is especially united in respect of policy to face up to the invasion of Ukraine, with a minority that is not negligible either. But I do not want to talk about this. I want, on the contrary, to emphasize that with this division of the West from the rest, there also is continuum. We cannot talk about complete division. I don't think that the world can be seen in binary perspectives. It doesn't exist neither in the international system nor within any of our countries in the north or in the south. Look at the table about what people think is the main reason Europe stands behind Ukraine or the US stands behind Ukraine. You will find that in China, 64% say that to defend Western dominance or defend their own security. You will find that in India, 16 and 23, 39%. But you will find that in the EU, these are 59%. 59% in the EU say that it's either to defend Western dominance or to defend their own security, which is not very far away from the perspectives in China. This is something positive to build upon. Look at another tip. In 10 years from now, which of the following do you think is more likely? You will see that in one of the options is a more even distribution of global power among multiple countries. You will find that the US 17%, Britain 16%, EU 19%, in India 21%, not very far. In Turkey 23%, not very far. What is a little bit far is in China and Russia. So in reality, there are common positions. We should not build our position, our policies on a perception that this is a division that cannot be mended. It can, on the condition that we understand why others think as they do. So for the global south, it should understand that Europe is very concerned. Europe has a history that justifies its concern. But Europe also, or the transatlantic alliance, should not just neglect the position of others and say that they do not really pay attention or pay sufficient attention to the rules-based order. No, they should also think why others are skeptical. Why others are skeptical when they see the reception of Ukrainian refugees, and it's a good reception, and I think they should enjoy this reception in Poland and other countries. They should absolutely. Why is it that different from the
Susie Dennison, that in the chat room, there have been other comments also about the fact that the erosion in the rule-based international order, based on international law and multilateral frameworks, has been undermined a long time ago, before this violation of the international order during the Ukraine war. And that is, as Dr. Ibrahim was also indicating, is adding to this lack of understanding and sometimes appreciation of why the uproar now, when that international order was violated and attempts at eroding it were happening much earlier. So this is something that is coming up in our chat room. I will add another very good question that's in the chat room before I turn it over to Ambassador Hartman and Susie Dennison. Again, another question from our Professor of Practice for Global Affairs, Karim Haggag, that there seems to be little thinking, at least coming through in today's intervention, of how to integrate Russia in an inclusive European security architecture after the war. And if we do not see that thinking coming through, there is, of course, the threat that this war will reproduce itself several years down the line. So, Ambassador Hartman and Susie Dennison, please add this to your reflections. How is Europe planning to integrate Russia in an inclusive European security architecture moving forward? Mm-hmm. Let's start with Ambassador Hartman and then move on to Susie Dennison. Over to you, Ambassador.
Okay, thank you, Noha. There are lots of aspects I could reply on now, but I try to limit myself to a few observations and ideas. Yeah. On one hand, we saw from the survey, the West is getting more coherent on its positions in this Ukraine war. And there may be the conclusion that the Western structures are being strengthened, but I would remind ourselves the West is not the West. What is the West? We also have to look in a more differentiated way. There is the United States, there is the European Union, there is Germany and France, and there is Great Britain and others. There is no such thing as a completely unified West, and we should not develop a cliche in this conflict, the West against the Russian Empire, but it is much more differentiated. We have had different opinions in other conflicts, like the Iraq war. Germany, for example, did not participate in the Iraq invasion. And these are details I often have to correct here in my discussions with Egyptians when everything is being put into the same basket. And yes, there have been injustice in other conflicts before, of course, and we have to concentrate very much in these days on the situation in the Middle East, on Israel's relationship with the Palestinians, the question of a two-state solution, which is growing even further into the non-achievable future. But one injustice does not justify another injustice. Yes, it may be that we Europeans see it very much from this Ukraine angle. We have to concentrate and to listen more to the global south. It is correct what Professor Ibrahim Awad said, but we cannot nullify one injustice by the other. Our focuses are different, but we have to listen also to the concerns and the worries about their regional security to the countries of the global south. And I would also like to pose the question, we saw in the survey by the ECFR, the question of whether Russia is getting stronger or weaker. I would like to counter ask you and the audience, what do you expect in the future from Russia? What do you expect from Russia's role in the Middle East and in Africa? We think that Russia's role is being, by the tremendous economic difficulties on the longer term, rather being weakened. We see China's position much, much stronger than Russia's. And Russia is doing a very good job with their narrative that they play a strong, apparently they would like to play a very strong role in this region. But what do countries like Egypt expect from Russia in terms of economic support in a crisis? And I think there is not much to expect from them in such a situation. So more differentiation. What is the West? Other conflicts, as I said, not everything can be put in one basket. And how is the world order to look like, or how can Russia be reintegrated in the European security architecture? It's a big question, Professor Haggag. I cannot answer. What is sure to me is what will not happen. We will not go back to the status quo ante. There will not be such a strong interaction economically and interdependency between the western part of Europe and Russia than before the crisis. We will not get back our 20 million euro investment in Russia, which is basically down to zero. Russia will not easily be reintegrated in an economic architecture or energy cooperation network with Europe. The trust has completely eroded. And the belief in institution is also being put at stake here. So I cannot answer this question, but we thought that the OSCE framework of 1975 is the larger framework. But even that is being called into question. So we have to start, I'm afraid, more or less from scratch to redefine our relations with Russia. But you are right, it cannot be an antagonistic relationship forever in the future because we remain neighbors. We have Poland and Ukraine and Belarus in between, but in fact, you can go by car from Berlin to Moscow in one day in peaceful times. So we have to come to terms with our relations with Russia, but in the end, it needs two to tango. And this depends very much on Russia's reaction, how they come out of this war scenario. We are willing to debate a future security structure with Russia, but it depends very much on themselves now, how they come to an end with this conflict. So far from me for the moment.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hartmann. Susie Dennison, over to you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, really interesting comments and questions from the floor. So I wanted to react briefly to the points which Dr. Ibrahim Awad was making just before he broke up about the fact that there is, in the same way as there is, that there are subtle differences in the data between different parts of the West and different parts of the global South. There are also areas of commonality, which I was not highlighting. And I think for me, that is both absolutely true and ought to be the basis of the way that we're thinking about an alliance building in the new order that is emerging right now. I don't mean that we ought to be all looking at ECFR data. I'm sure there's plenty of other sources that we could be using, but it is exactly that process of understanding what sits behind the positions which different states take on different issues, and looking at where we can come to agreement and where there is desire to work together on different things. And just to take an example, I think that a lot of diplomatic energy was, I know, put into the UN General Assembly resolutions around the war in Ukraine and trying to sort of corral a collective position, and by diplomats. And I think that what was quite striking in the aftermath of some of those that didn't go as successfully as we might have hoped was this sense of needing to understand what went wrong around that particular story. I think what we increasingly need to get used to is understanding that there is no one story in this international picture now. There are a multitude of different stories which we need to understand. And to respond to the question in the chat as part of this, I think we need to understand what baggage we're bringing to the table, and whether or not we are always the most effective voice as Europeans on certain issues. But we also need to understand that where there are areas of common interest and where we have potentially more leverage if we work differently as part of a broader conversation with different powers. So I think I agree very much with this idea that we are in some aspects part of the problem when it comes to the defense of the existing international order, that we are up against a perception, and I completely take the point from Ambassador Hartmann that is not necessarily correct always to talk about the whole of Europe when we're thinking about Kosovo, when we're thinking about engagement in Iraq and elsewhere. But nevertheless, I think that perception is there, and it's the perception that we're dealing with. But I think where I would disagree is with the premise of the question. How do we respond to that to shore up the existing order? my sense is that we need to think differently, and we need to understand that this is a reordering moment. And perhaps that means identifying quite ruthlessly where are the areas within the system where we have an interest in preserving existing structures, where are there parts of the system where fundamentally it is not working, whether that is down to the riding of roughshod over the international rules by Russia and other powers, or whether that is down to other factors. It is nevertheless a situation which is changing. And then just a kind of a final comment to react to Ambassador Hartmann's question point on what to expect Russia over the longer term. I think I very much agreed with his own answer to the question, but I think what I would add is that it's not only from my point of view that we will have to work with Russia because they are quite near neighbours. It is also that on a range of different global goods, whether it's climate change, whether it's tackling pandemics, we all have a common interest in ensuring that the system works. And so there will be areas on which we will need to cooperate more or less closely with Russia and its allies. And so it's about future-proofing that system of cooperation and ensuring that we can still work together on these global goods, as well as remaining and retaining solid positions with respect to what Russia is doing on this conflict.
Thank you very much, both of you, for engaging so candidly with the remarks made and the questions raised. I cannot let both of you go without reminding of what's going on in France right now, another leading country of the European Union. And what is there is, of course, complex and has all sorts of idiosyncrasies of a political nature. But I want to raise with you another issue that has to do with the anticipated increase in military spending that Europe is building up toward, and how that... Is my voice breaking here as well?
There was an echo, but I can hear you clearly.
Okay. And how Europe will be able to balance its increasing military expenditure in conventional and non-conventional warfare, for good reason, very, very many people would argue, with its very heavy social spending to maintain its welfare state system, which had contributed primarily to 70 years of peace and growth and development in Europe that made Europe the model that everybody was seeking to understand, if not emulate. There is a tango dance here. There is a tension between the security agenda for Europe and its social welfare model. Your very quick comments on that, based on what you hear from your citizen surveys, as well as what you know is happening in the foreign policy circles that you deal with. Over to you, and let's start with Ambassador Hartmann. I know you have to leave us soon, Ambassador, so over to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Noah. Yes, you're absolutely right. Ukraine is not the only topic we're discussing back home. In France, it's about pension reform from 62 to 64 years of retirement age. Well, by the way, we have already increased it up to 67 without having such tremendous demonstrations. But we're having a general strike today, actually, in Germany, including all the airports and transportation and so on. And it is about wages. It's about wage increase of what the trade unions demand, up to 10%. So we have other issues, and you're right, there is a conflict on expenditure. We have a budget review, and the Minister of Finance said, I cannot cater for 70 billions of the additional wishes by different ministries. We need to invest on education. Education, universities, schools is a tremendous investment backlog, so to say. And we have the generational demands of climate change. We do not want to ease our efforts in fighting against climate change only through the Ukraine crisis. And thirdly, you are right, social security expenditures are also on the increase. So in the end, we have to find a balance. It's not only about security, it's about internal coherence in a highly differentiated social security model. It is about remaining competitive in the universities, in science and in research, in development, in the industry, and maintain the social coherence and social peace. That is very important. And we see these conflicts in France and partly also in Germany. And that demands additional spending on social security, on education, on research and development. So this is, of course, a conflict. And in the end, we only intensify our military spending due to our defensive posture. We think, and we are also feeling indirectly threatened by what is happening now. So we cannot neglect that there is an external threat factor to our European security. So we have to be prepared for that. That's why we have to do this. If the situation eases, if, Ambassador Hagak, we find more longer-term security structures again after the end of this conflict, I doubt whether this will be possible within a shorter period of time. But of course, we do not have to maintain a package of 100 billion euros for defense. This is a wishful thinking, but for the time being, we need it, and we need it urgently. But you're right, there are other policy areas which are in competition when it comes to budget resources, namely on social security and on education and investment. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you can stick with us for a couple of minutes more until we hear from Susie and then wrap up our conversation. Susie, over to you.
I mean, I will be very brief. I think that I live and work in France, so just a very quick comment on the tensions there. I think that there, of course, is a risk with the intense necessary political focus on the domestic situation at the moment of read across into the external posture that France is able to take, and the prioritization in public spending terms on what France is able to do. But I think that for now we're not there yet. There is a very peripheral campaign being pushed by, I think it's the CGT, one of the major unions, which you see on some posters arguing that money should be going to workers, not weapons. But for now, this is very peripheral to the debate. And my sense is that there is a broader concern, which Ambassador Hartman rightly said, is about security among the European public. But I think there is also a broader sense of what security means. And we're hearing more and more about this idea of economic security, the necessity of building up resilient systems in order to be able to operate in a world in which everything can be weaponized. And we're seeing that happen in the case of the Russian conflict. So my feeling is that this is, of course, all wrapped up together. But I think it's sort of incumbent on political leaders to build that clear narrative about how these things all fit together, and the necessity of our ability to take strong positions on the international stage in order to shape a rules-based system in which Europeans can survive and thrive, and how that fits into the economic dimension for citizens.
Thank you very much. We are coming to the end of our session today. Definitely, we have scratched the surface of a very complex topic. We would like to return in the coming weeks to questions raised in this session on how will Europe define its security framework moving forward? How will Europe reconcile that with its social cohesion agenda, which has been so paramount in maintaining peace and unity in Europe for the past years? And a very important point you mentioned, which will be my final point for today, that the division that we see between Europe and some of the rest of the world is also reflecting in media and new media narratives. So understanding the dynamics of the media narrative moving forward in a multipolar, equal, just world order will be of paramount importance. I hope we will have Ambassador Hartman and Susie Dennison and the rest of the colleagues from the European Council with us in future conversations, because today was just the beginning. And as I said, the School of GAPP, Global Affairs and Public Policy, will also invite other regions to enter in this conversation in order for us to better understand what it takes to build a better, peaceful, and just multilateral global order moving forward. I thank you, Ambassador Hartman, very much for being with us. Susie Dennison, thank you very much. Professor Ibrahim Awad, thank you very much. Sorry for the bad connection that we had, but your points and messages came very clear and loud. Thank you all for joining us during Ramadan. Ramadan Kareem to you all, and see you again soon.